will get 10:30 Pacific time, and I will get us started in the interest of everybody's time. My name is Samantha. I'm with First 5 Lake County, and we are proud to host today's webinar. At First 5, our vision is that one day the success of Lake County and California will be measured by the well-being of its youngest children. And our mission is to build the early childhood systems and supports needed to ensure our youngest children are safe, healthy, and ready to succeed in school and life. Our webinar today is a step in that direction as we turn our attention to ACEs, historical trauma, and our well-being. We are grateful in partnership with Lake County Child Welfare Services and Hubel Las Positas Community College District for providing the funding to make today's webinar possible. We ask that you please keep yourself on mute while our speaker is talking. As I mentioned, I will be keeping track of the chat, so if you have any questions that come up, I'll be able to answer them as we go along. If you don't have a last name on your name card, if you can either change your name to include your last name or put your name in the chat. I am trying to take attendance for our grant purposes. Our teacher today is Susan Bolio, and I will let her introduce herself. Welcome, Susan, and thank you.
Hey, great, Samantha. Bonjour, nagani benesi kwe Indigenous, megizin endodem, mesquaga mevizaga igening nendonjaba. So hello, my name is Susan Bolio, and I'm a citizen of the Red Lake Nation here in Minnesota, northern Minnesota. I currently work for the University of Minnesota Extension, mother of 4. I have quite the spread. My oldest is 23, my youngest is 4, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. A lot of the work that I do in Minnesota is working with Indigenous communities and individuals also in recovery to understand this information and then to teach different skills and practices and things. We'll be doing a couple today, and we'll actually open with one in just a minute, that can help us to reset the nervous system, to reconnect with ourselves, and to have greater well-being in our lives. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. Can everyone see this? Can see the opening slide? Okay, awesome. So this really has been a journey for me, and Samantha and I were talking about this a little bit before we got on today, is I first learned about adverse childhood experiences 8 years ago this spring. I was very pregnant with my then 3rd child, and I knew that I really wanted to get this information to Indigenous communities. I had been working with tribes for about 10 years at that point, and we were talking about historical trauma, but there was still this like gap in understanding of how these things continue to sort of pull through our experiences today. And so that really started my own healing journey, as well as just a desire to learn all I could to better understand these dynamics. So we're going to start with the practice. I was trained in the Center for Mind-Body Medicine's Mind-Body Medicine curriculum. And this is a really foundational practice. I use this practice every day. It's super accessible. You can use it while you're washing dishes, driving a car. I often use it before I have to go referee a fight between 2 of my children. So it's just a great way to sort of bring myself back into my body, regulate my nervous system before I respond to what's happening. You can do this with your eyes opened or closed, whatever feels best for you. But I invite you to get yourself into a comfortable position. And then if closing your eyes feels good, you can close your eyes. Otherwise, just having a soft gaze at whatever's in front of you. We're trying to minimize visual distractions around us. And let's start with a nice grounding breath together. So big inhale in through the nose. A slow exhale out through the mouth. And then as you continue breathing at whatever pace is comfortable for you, I invite you to bring that breath deep into the diaphragm. And it might even be helpful to just place one hand over your chest and one hand over your stomach, just to be able to feel where that breath is going in the body. Is it stopping in the chest, or are you able to get it down into the diaphragm? And so then imagining that your belly is like a balloon, that as you slowly inhale in through the nose, you're expanding that balloon out. And then as you slowly exhale out through the mouth, that balloon is deflating. And you can think to yourself, if you'd like, if it's helpful, soft as you breathe in and belly as you breathe out, to remind yourself to keep your belly nice and relaxed, to let that air come deep into the diaphragm. And you might notice a really busy mind. And if you notice a busy mind, as soon as you notice that your mind is wandering and you're no longer focused on your breath, suddenly you are aware again. And in that moment of awareness, you have the choice to bring your attention back to your breath. And so I invite you to do that anytime you notice your mind wandering, just bringing your attention back to the breath, thinking soft as you breathe in through the nose and belly as you breathe out through the mouth. Taking a few more slow, deep belly breaths. And then we'll close with another breath together, inhaling deeply in through the nose. And a nice slow exhale out through the mouth. And then maybe before you open your eyes, if you have your eyes closed yet, just taking a moment to check in with your body, noticing how your body feels in this moment, checking in with your emotions and what's present with you emotionally in this moment, checking in with your thoughts and noticing how quickly or slowly thoughts are coming or going. And then also checking in with your sense of connection to self and others. So checking in with those 4 parts of who we are. And then when you feel ready, you can go ahead and open your eyes. If you had your eyes closed, bringing yourself back fully into this space together. So just a little bit of the science behind this breath for those of you who maybe haven't done soft belly breathing before. There's a nerve called the vagal nerve, and it's called the wandering nerve because it wanders all throughout our torso. So it connects to the base of our brain and it goes around our heart and around our stomach. And so when we can take those slow, deep belly breaths, it activates the vagal nerve, which sends the message back to the brain that we're physically safe. If you were running or fighting for your life, taking those slow, deep belly breaths would be impossible. So the fact that you can take them means that you're safe and that your brain gets that message, and then it calms the nervous system, brings the parasympathetic nervous system online, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. And so that's why this can be such a powerful breath practice. One of the things that I was taught is our breath is literally the most powerful tool we have to regulate our nervous system. So, so breath practices can be a great way to sort of shift us out of that fight or flight response, which we'll talk about more in a bit, and into that rest and digest parasympathetic nervous state. So here's an overview of our time together today. We're gonna talk, sort of do a trauma overview, like what is trauma, from sort of how I have come to understand it after 7.5 years of really digging into it. And then looking at historical trauma, what's the definition and what's been the experience of Indigenous people in the United States. Again, just a super high overview. There are whole semester classes or whole semesters on historical trauma. So there's a lot that we won't be able to dig into, but we're going to talk about some of those overarching pieces. Looking at something called epigenetics and intergenerational trauma. So understanding how this trauma can get transmitted across generations, understanding the stress response and the physiology of stress and trauma and the connection to ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. So we're going to touch on that as well. We actually will, I'm going to save this triggers and emotions piece for the next session that I do. I think it's in a couple weeks. Samantha, I can't quite remember. It might even be next week or the 2 weeks. I'm not sure. We'll do a couple more practices. We're going to do a body scan and a heart-centered meditation today. And then we're going to really look at just some tools and practices for reconnecting the mind, body, and spirit. So these are two individuals who have really shaped how I think about trauma. So Gabor Mate is the individual on the top. He's a medical doctor. He's written several books. One is In the Hungry Realm of Ghosts. So he really tries to help people understand the connection between adverse childhood experiences or ACEs and addiction. And then Thomas Hubel, I'm currently taking a class with him. He has amazing stuff, but he really is trying to help us better understand the connections between individual, collective, and ancestral trauma, and what that means, what the impacts are, but also what the possibilities and potentials are. So one of the things that both of these people say is that trauma isn't the event itself. A lot of times when we think of trauma, we think about a traumatic event that happened. But trauma isn't the thing that happens to us. It's what happens inside of us because of what happens to us. And a lot of times what happens inside of us is impacted by whether or not we have individual strategies or practices to help us navigate the big emotions and overwhelm that's coming up, or whether or not we have supports outside of us. So family, friends, systems of support, those types of things. So if we have those, that trauma, actually we're able to metabolize it and move through it pretty quickly, that trauma energy, and it doesn't stay stuck. But we don't have the individual capabilities because we haven't learned them. These are things that need to be taught. These are not things that we come in innately knowing how to do. When we don't have those individual capabilities, or we don't have the relationships to help us navigate that, or the supports, that's when there ends up being problems. So we're going to talk more about that. Another important point that Gabor makes is that pain is not the same thing as trauma. So pain happens. Difficult things happen in life. That is part of being human, part of the human experience, but not all pain leads to trauma. And some pain can lead to trauma. Again, what are those mitigating factors? And then another really important piece that has shifted the way that I think about trauma that they both talk about is how trauma is often a separation. So Hubel talks about how when we get overwhelmed, our nervous system gets overwhelmed by whatever it is that happens to us, whatever that event is, and we don't have the ability to move through it. Because our nervous system is overwhelmed, we cannot function with an overwhelmed nervous system. We just can't. Think about the last time that you felt super stressed out. It's hard to think, it's hard to do anything. And so what we do, sort of the wisdom of the trauma response, is we end up sort of shutting down to, or cutting off, so to speak, that experience, that energy, and parking it in what Hubel says is a numb place, a place where we can't feel it, because as long as we feel it, we're overwhelmed by it. So we have to put it somewhere in our system, in our nervous system, in our bodies, where we can't feel it. And so the thing about it, though, is that energy that gets sort of cut off then becomes a separation. We have separated from a part of ourselves. And there's wisdom in that energy that has been frozen. And so when we are able to go back and integrate those experiences, when we have the individual capabilities, when we have the relationships that we need, the systems of support, and we're able to integrate that information and that experience, that energy gets freed up to be able to use into the future. So as I think about, as Indigenous people, there's a whole lot of trauma that's frozen under what Hubel would say the permafrost. from our experiences, the unresolved experiences, because our ancestors did not have the ability to be able to navigate and move through that. And we'll talk more about why in a little bit. This is a graph that really has really helped me. I'm a very visual person, so it's really helped me sort of just like, this is what happens in our nervous system when we are when we're in our ventral vagal. That's when we feel a sense of connection and openness and curiosity and groundedness. This feels really good to be in this part of our nervous system. But when something stressful or difficult happens and the arousal increases, we start to move into our sympathetic nervous system. And with that comes either the flight response, which is a movement away from whatever the experience is. And with that comes emotions like panic, fear, anxiety, worry, and concern. Or we might go into fight mode. And that fight mode is a movement towards where we're trying to deal with it head on in a sort of way. But with that often comes emotions like rage, anger, irritation, and frustration. Now, if we are not able to run from whatever it is or fight whatever it is, again, we can't stay in that hyper-aroused state. So what happens is our nervous system moves into this blue area, this dorsal vagal part, and this is the freeze or collapse response. So again, this is sort of like when you can't run or fight, the next best option is to start to shut down so that you're not really feeling in the same way that you would be feeling the experience if you were in your ventral vagal or your sympathetic nervous system. So with this freeze response comes things like dissociation, numbness, depression, helplessness, shame, shutdown, hopelessness, feeling trapped. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these states as well. But I just thought this is a really great visual to sort of understand what happens in our nervous system. And then, of course, with practices or supports, co-regulation from other, we're able to bring our nervous system back into that green state. But some of us, our nervous systems have been wired because of our experiences to very quickly go into fight or flight, or very quickly go into that dissociative freeze response. So we're going to sort of start with then looking at historical trauma. And Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart first coined the term back in the 90s, and she defines it as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from massive group trauma. So this is different than intergenerational trauma, which we'll touch on in a minute, in that these are traumas that happen very specifically to groups of people because of who these groups of people are. So it's different than just regular trauma. It's done to a whole collective, to a group of people. And so if you want to either type in the chat, which I'm going to see if I can pull up here so that I can see it as well. I'm going to try. And then also you have the ability to unmute if you want to unmute. But I'm curious, what do you know about historical trauma as it relates to Indigenous peoples here in the United States? And again, feel free to pop it in the chat if you don't want to unmute, or you can unmute yourself as well. So I see someone said health. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? What do you, is there a specific experience, education, health? I'm guessing with education, maybe that's boarding schools, trauma carried through generations. Yep. Forced relocation, boarding school, repression of religion. Yep. Yeah, destruction of community, and I would even suggest family. Yep, through forced removal. Yep, suppression, mass murder. Yeah, let's call it what it is: genocide, forced relocation. Yeah. Yep, passed from generation, from one generation to another. Boarding schools, relocation, stripped from culture, assimilation, displacement, oppression of cultural beliefs, traditions, genocide, higher mortality rates. Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that I always find interesting is that, you know, a lot of this history is not taught in our schools here in the United States, but I've done some presentations where I have people who grew up in other parts of the world, And they literally cannot believe that the people who grew up here don't know these things that you're sharing and some of the pieces that I'm going to talk about. It's pretty common knowledge in other parts of the world. It is not common knowledge here. So some of you touched on this already, thinking about things like warfare and genocide. There were not censuses done way back in the day, but the sort of estimates that they have for the contiguous United States is anywhere between like 15 and 40 million Indigenous people that lived here pre-contact. And then by 1900, that number was hovering around 250,000. So we're talking about a huge number of Indigenous people who, were wiped out in that very short period of time. So one of the major contributors initially was disease. So there were a lot of diseases that came over from Europe that us as Indigenous people, we did not have immunities to, and we all just went through a pandemic. We're still in some ways in it, right? And so imagine things like measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, all of these things just coming through and ravaging Indigenous populations that did not have immunities to these diseases. And then there also was removal of food sources. So some of you have probably already seen this picture before, but these are just the skulls of buffalo. So our Plains relatives, a lot of them heavily relied on the buffalo, had an intimate relationship with them, relied on them for food, shelter, clothing. They would follow the herds around. And around 1800, there were around 60 million buffalo on the plains of the United States, which is an incredible number. But by 1895, just 95 years later, there were less than 1,000. And this was super intentional. At that time, that's when the federal government was trying to fight the Plains tribes to force them onto the reservations. But as long as they could, be self-sufficient, they were like, there's no way you're going to force us onto the reservations. Well, so the government said, well, I guess the thing that we can do then is to get rid of the buffalo, because if they can't be self-sustaining, then they'll have to go on the reservation. And they actually found that there were a lot of tribes that after the buffalo were almost completely wiped out in this country, a lot of the tribes did end up signing treaty agreements and being moved to the reservations. One other thing I'll say really quickly about this is, another thing that was happening during that time is they were trying to connect the railroads from the east and west coasts. And so it was sort of like this, well, we can sort of kill two birds with one stone. We, with all of these bison, that'd be really hard to get trains to go through the United States. And so that also helped them be able to free up to lay the railroads to connect the east and west coasts of the United States. There was also comments in here about removal and relocations, and this happened many, many, many times for a lot of Indigenous peoples. There is one famous relocation story that we do learn a little bit about in school, and what is that one? What's the relocation story that we sometimes hear about in schools? Yep, the Trail of Tears, yeah. And so the thing is, I was learning more about the Trail of Tears. The thing that's really interesting about this, and also incredibly sad, and is that the Trail of Tears primarily impacted 5 tribes on the sort of southeast part of the United States. So the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. And they were considered the 5 civilized tribes because they got baptized, they learned to speak English, they became farmers, they wore white clothes, they lived in houses like other settlers did. They did everything they were told to do to fit in. And in the end, it didn't matter. Andrew Jackson said all Indians need to be removed west of the Mississippi. And so the Trail of Tears was one of the ways that they removed groups from the East Coast west of the Mississippi. And, another sort of thing to think about in this is when you as Indigenous people, your people have lived in a place for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You know what plants you can eat, what plants are medicine and what those medicines can be used for. You have a relationship with the animals, you understand the seasons, like all of those pieces. But I don't know if anybody, I've been to North Carolina. I've not been to Oklahoma, but I've seen pictures. They are incredibly different places, different plants, different animals, different everything. And so you go from being completely self-sufficient to going to a place where you don't have a relationship with those plants and animals. You don't know what they can be used for. That really started and helped create that dependence on the government for food, annuities, clothing, blankets, those types of things. And then, the relocation didn't stop there. It went even into I got to find my time thing really quickly if I can. I think it was 1960s, I believe, when the Indian Relocation Act. And that was one that impacted my family, where there was sort of this push to get Indigenous people off the reservations. And there were 5 or 6 major cities across the country that they were trying to send Indigenous peoples to. So Chicago, Denver, Oakland, and you'll know now, or many of you probably know, in a lot of those cities, there continues to be a very large urban Native population there because of this Relocation Act. And it's a little hard to see, but on the flyer, it says, chance of a lifetime, come to Denver, good jobs, happy homes, training. So sort of this promise that if you come here, we'll help you get housing and get a job, and, life is good, because life on the reservation was incredibly challenging. Food and annuities and payments, if they came at all, they came late. The food might come rotten. People were starving to death. They were freezing to death. It was a very difficult place to be. I know as an Anishinaabe, the way that we lived by the seasons, and we traveled around quite a bit. We had summer camps, which was different from our berry camps, which was different from our Monoman or wild rice camps, which was different from our winter camps. So we were very spread out. And so then to be sort of all in one area, there were not enough, there just wasn't enough food and stuff for everyone to be able to survive. So lots of different times where tribes were removed and relocated. Some of you probably already know this because there seems to be a lot of knowledge about this, which is awesome. But Oklahoma was originally intended to be the Indian state. They were going to try to move all Native people to Oklahoma and sort of confine us to that area. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but that's why you see there's a lot of different tribes in Oklahoma that originated in different parts of the United States. They did not originate in Oklahoma. And so there was mention of the boarding schools, and the boarding school era started in 1879, with Carlisle Boarding School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And lasted through the 1930s. There was a really scathing report called the Merriam Report, where some agents and folks went in and looked at the schools and what was happening and the atrocities that were happening. And basically they made the schools start shutting down. And so there was mention in some of the, in the chat, some of the things with the boarding schools. You can see here on the right-hand side, this is the same group of kids coming into the boarding schools, and then after being in the boarding school. So haircut, dress changed, names changed, and just that and being taken from your families is trauma enough. And another, I think, important thing to remember is that for a lot of Indigenous communities, it wasn't just about nuclear families. It wasn't just mom and dad and kids. Aunties and uncles were considered like moms and dads. Cousins were like siblings. Grandparents were very much involved in the rearing of children. So it was an extended kinship and family network that raised kids. It wasn't just a small nuclear family. So the removal of children really impacted the entire community. And, for any of us that have children, I'm sure we can imagine, although we might not like to, how traumatic and how heartbreaking that would be to have your children removed. And then, of course, in the schools, there were incredible atrocities that happened. Physical abuses for speaking your language, for practicing, or for doing your traditional Native games, for doing anything related to your culture, because the purpose of these schools was assimilation. It was not education, it was assimilation. Up until that point, the federal government had not been able to successfully assimilate most of the adults, the Indigenous adults. And so instead they thought, well, if we take the kids, we can assimilate them, and then, we'll be done with the Indian problem. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a quote from General Richard Pratt, who started the Carlisle, Pennsylvania school. He says, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead, kill the Indian in him and save the man. And then the one on the right is from a bishop. So some of the schools were run by the federal government, some of the schools were run by churches. And so the goal of residential school, they say, we instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. And there's some interesting research that's come out by Brene Brown looking at guilt and shame. And shame is very highly correlated with addiction, with depression, with mental health issues. Shame is about, there's something wrong with me. And that very much was the message that was sent to our ancestors who went through boarding schools, that as Native people, there was something wrong with them, that it was terrible to be a Native person, that the beliefs were, inferior and they were savage and all of these different things. So it very much was assimilation through humiliation for multiple generations who went through the boarding schools. And then, of course, the assimilation, the attempted assimilation did not stop there with the boarding schools. It continued into the adoption and foster care era, which was between 1957, 1967, although even here in Minnesota today, Indigenous children are taken and are in out-of-home placement at a significantly higher rate than any other group in the state. And so the Indian Adoption Project was a federal program that involved the Child Welfare League of America, and it also involved churches. And during this time, there were over a third of Native children removed, oftentimes without home visits or anything. I have a good friend of mine who does a lot of work on healing this particular wound around the adoption foster care era. Her name is Sandy Whitehawk. And she, her story is just heartbreaking, being stolen essentially from her family at 18 months of age. Social worker just rolled up on the Pine Ridge or Rosebud Reservation, snatched her. She was 18 months old and drove off. And Sandy didn't meet her birth family until she was, I think, in her 30s or 40s. She was adopted out to a white family where she experienced incredible abuse. And so the purpose really continued to be assimilation at this point, because 2/3 of the children were placed in non-Native homes. So another thing that Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart coined is historical trauma response. So this HTR, she says it's the constellation of features in reaction to this trauma, to historical trauma. And again, this was a brief overview. There's so much more that we could go into. But she says it often includes depression, self-destructive behaviors, suicidal thoughts and gestures, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, and difficulty recognizing and expressing emotions. It may include substance abuse, often an attempt to avoid painful feelings through self-medication. So when you think about, again, that graph that's of Stephen Porges with the ventral vagal nerve, the green on the bottom, the red and the blue, when you are a child and you are in a boarding school and you cannot leave, what part of your nervous system do you think you learn to be in? You learn to be in that blue, dissociated, checked out response. And you learn to cope with whatever's available. And so substances like alcohol and things like that in our communities, some of those substances have changed. Methamphetamines, opioids are really good at addressing pain, and our brain doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional pain. And so recognizing a lot of these things as coping mechanisms. I don't hardly hear it anymore, but I remember early on when I first started presenting this, sometimes once in a blue moon, I would hear somebody say, that was a long time ago. How come you all don't get over it? And the thing that I really appreciate about epigenetics is as Indigenous people, I know as Anishinaabe, we actually had a concept called blood memory, where we understood that the experiences of our ancestors gets passed down. And so we like to joke and say now that science has caught up with with Indigenous wisdom. And so epigenetics is about, epi means to sit on top of. So it's what sits on top of our genetic code. Some of you are probably my age or a little bit older and remember the really robust debate. Is it nature or nurture? What is it that's most impactful? Well, it's both. Epigenetics shows us that it's both. So our genetic or DNA code can actually get turned on or turned off by the experiences that we have. So it's about understanding how the experiences we have can turn on or turn off genetic code, which then those epigenetic changes can get passed on to future generations. So there was a study that was done to look at this, or to better understand this. And what they found is they would take male mice and they would have them in cages, and they would have in the bottom of their cages shock pads. And every time they would infuse a scent, a particular scent, it was the scent of cherry blossoms, they would shock the feet of the mice. So they did this over and over again, and an association was made between the smell and the pain. And they took that first generation and they bred them to females. The females had pups. They let the pups grow up. They didn't do anything to them. When they were fully grown, they did just the scent of cherry blossom. And those little mice went scurrying to the corner of their cages. They were shaking and terrified trying to get out. They had a really big stress response. They took that second generation. They bred them to females. The females had pups. The pups grew up, didn't do anything to them. When they were fully grown, scent of cherry blossoms, same terrified response. And there were more smell receptors in their nose for cherry blossoms. And there had been structural changes in the brain. So I often ask, what do you think is the point of epigenetics? Why do you think it exists? What is the point of epigenetics? Yes, exactly. Survival. When in doubt, the answer to the questions I ask will be survival. And I think that's really important, because I think sometimes, especially those of us who individually or collectively have experienced a ton of trauma, we see these responses as something bad, as something that we shouldn't be doing, as something that, we somehow should be able to stop. But these are natural responses to trauma for survival. So that being said, I also want to say that epigenetics, it's not just the trauma of our ancestors that gets passed on, but it is also the strengths and the resilience of our ancestors, because that too helps us to survive. The last thing that I'll note in this, and this I think is really important when we're working, especially with children who've experienced a lot of trauma. Dr. Brian Diaz, he's one of the authors of some of the epigenetic studies. And one of the things that they found is that we have the chronological clock, which is like every day I'm a day older, every month I'm a month older, every year I'm a year older. That's our chronological clock. And then we have our biological clock. And when we experience trauma, our biological and chronological clocks no longer line up. Our biological clock moves much faster, which means that those critical windows of development in childhood get shortened. So we have less time to do interventions that can be really impactful. So just recognizing that a lot of times that trauma, because it speeds up our biological clock, you might have a 10-year-old who's menstruating as a result of that biological clock being sped up. There's also another critical window. We won't talk as much about it today, but right before puberty, where the brain is reorganizing and it's pruning away certain synapses and things like that. So it's another really critical brain development time besides 0 to 5. And so again, just thinking about all of these windows of critical development get shortened when people have experienced trauma. So then there's also, in addition to the epigenetic, how that gets transmitted, that trauma can get transmitted, it also can get transmitted intergenerationally. And so this speaks to a lot more of, so sort of two pieces to it. One is just through biology. So I attended an international trauma conference, and they were talking about how in some of their studies, they had mothers who had experienced a lot of ACEs, but when they were pregnant, they were not experiencing a lot of stress or trauma. They were in healthy relationships and things were going pretty well for them. And they compared those babies to the babies of mothers who had not experienced high ACEs. And what they found is that the mothers who had experienced high ACEs, even if they weren't currently under a lot of stress and trauma, their nervous systems tended to get activated very quickly. And when we get our stress response gets activated, we'll talk more about this in a little bit. We have a whole host of chemicals chemicals that change in our body. We get adrenaline and cortisol and all of those stress hormones. And those stress hormones then go through the baby and begin to wire that baby's biology and brain. And so what they found is that even after those children were born, even if they had not experienced trauma themselves in childhood, they saw behavior problems, they saw learning problems, their brains tended to be smaller, more neurons tended to be in the base of the brain where our survival mode is, or our survival instincts and stuff are, versus neurons up here in the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain. So even without that baby experiencing trauma itself, the mother's biology is wiring the baby, basically saying you're going to be born into a dangerous world. Your fight or flight response needs to be really on to be able to survive this. So that's one way that this trauma can get passed intergenerationally. And another is through behaviors. So when we learn certain behaviors, I think about boarding schools again. And as Anishinaabe people, and it's my understanding that a lot of Indigenous people had this belief and had names for our little ones that reflected back the spirit beings that they were, the spirit bundles that they were, the gifts that they were. And so we didn't have things like physical abuse and sexual abuse that existed in our communities. But because generation after generation experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect in the boarding schools, some of those behaviors and patterns started to get passed down through our communities because of the experiences in boarding schools. Another thing that I'll mention related to this would be, sometimes you hear boarding school survivors, like the children of them saying, my mom or dad never said they loved me. They never hugged me. Like they were not physically affectionate. And again, a lot of that goes back to the experience that they had in boarding school, and that shut down dissociative response that they were in to try to manage the big emotions that they had to constantly keep down from those experiences that they were not able to move through in boarding school. And so that too is another way that response, those trauma responses can get passed down through generations. So we're going to take a moment and just pause, and let's, it's some pretty heavy stuff. Some of it I know you've heard before, but just taking a moment to check in with your body and noticing sensations you might feel in the body. Our body has an incredible amount of wisdom, and it is constantly talking to us. So just noticing, as you sort of scan down through the body, what sensations are coming up for you? And maybe what thoughts or emotions are coming up for you. Often emotions can be connected to sensations in the body. Thoughts and emotions are very much connected. We'll talk more about that in the next session. Just sort of checking in with what's going on with you right now, in your body, in your emotions, with your thoughts. And then maybe just thinking about, again, some really great comments in the chat. There are a lot of people that know a lot about historical trauma, but just really curious and sort of asking yourself, you can plop into the chat, you can unmute yourself, but why do you think recognizing the experiences of Indigenous people is so important for either your personal and or professional development? Why does it matter to know these things? Anyone have any thoughts? Why is it important to know and understand these things? So someone said it gives us a better understanding of what we might see or feel in Indigenous communities and families. Understanding why people respond the way they do. Yeah, it's important for building empathy, compassion for self too. I know as an Indigenous person, understanding this stuff really helped me to have more compassion, understanding for my own reactions and how, I was showing up in the world, and recognizing that unresolved trauma still inside of me and those patterns that were being passed down. Yeah, to work through the past for a better future. Yeah, I mean, we definitely are not talking about this to stay stuck in the past, but to really understand how to move forward in a good way. We have to understand what's driving our current behaviors and patterns. If we don't understand those pieces, then they sort of continue to run at the unconscious level. So the more we can bring awareness to why these things exist and what's driving them, we can heal that trauma, free up that energy that's been frozen individually and collectively to be able to create a better future for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. Yeah, for healing. And yeah, I love this. Native people and children do not exist in a vacuum. And this is I think another sort of piece that we sometimes forget, is that hurt people, right? That's a saying that we have. And so the people that came over from Europe were very hurt themselves, had experienced incredible trauma in Europe, did not heal from that, came over here and perpetuated that trauma onto the Indigenous peoples here. So it's not just Indigenous people that need to heal, it's all of us that need to heal. And we are all connected and interconnected. So when I harm you, I'm also harming myself. We are connected. We do not live in a vacuum. And so understanding this interconnection and how these things play into and interact with one another is really, really important. Yeah, make way for that. Okay, so we're going to move into talking a little bit more about ACEs and the stress response in the body. So as I mentioned, I got trained in ACEs about 7.5 years ago. And when I first got trained, the pyramid on the left, that's the pyramid that we use. Sort of the hypothesis of the ACE study was that these ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, would lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which would lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, which could lead to disease, disability, and social problems, and then early death. And so as we were out doing these presentations, our communities and us, we were like, but our communities didn't start with high ACEs. It started with historical trauma, which led to these other things. So they added to the bottom of the pyramid generational embodiment in historical trauma, which leads to social conditions and local contexts, which then lead to complex trauma and ACEs, which leads to high allostatic loads, overwhelm of the nervous system, disrupted neurodevelopment, which then often leads to coping mechanisms and behaviors, which then leads to the burden of disease, distress, criminalization, stigmatization, and then early death. And some of the studies have shown that for individuals who have 6 or more ACEs, if those ACEs haven't been mitigated or offset by healing and relationships and learning practices to regulate our nervous systems, on average, people with ACEs of 6 or higher die 20 years sooner than someone with an ACE score of 0. So when I think about my dad's parents passing in their 60s, my dad just passed last January, he was 71. That's pretty young, right? The constant high allostatic load, overwhelm of the nervous system decreases our life expectancy. Remember that biological age versus chronological age? The biological age is significantly older than the chronological age. And then on this side, you see things like microaggressions, implicit bias, epigenetics, all of these things play into it as well. And so these are the original 10 ACEs that they looked at. Many of you have probably seen this before. The original ACEs fall under 3 main categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So under abuse, there's things like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Under neglect, there's physical and emotional neglect. And then under household dysfunction, there's mental illness of a primary caregiver, incarceration of a relative, domestic violence, substance use issues, and divorce or separation. And the divorce or separation piece really speaks to all the fighting and chaos, the bickering that's happening in the household when parents aren't getting along and they're about to separate or divorce. And that's what creates that sort of toxic environment for children. Now, these are not the only 10 ACEs that can happen to a young person, but these were the 10 that they chose based on the literature at the time, what they were seeing as being really impactful. And there have been communities since then who have added additional things, because most of these fall under what happens within a household, but they added things like community violence or bullying at school or things like that. Because again, these ACEs do not happen in isolation in households. They happen across our communities. One of the findings that they had is that there's this really high dose response relationship, that the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to experience negative health outcomes, negative social outcomes, behavioral health problems, things like that. And what's important to note here is that when they did this study, it's what's called an epidemiological study. So they're looking at the population. It's not a one-to-one. So if you do, you can Google like find my ACE score. If you haven't done that before, you can take the 10 questionnaire thing, get your ACE score, but it is not a one-to-one. It does not mean I have an ACE score of 8 or 9, therefore I'm doomed to experience blah, 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 blah. It doesn't work like that because there's lots of other factors that play in. What sort of social supports did I have? What sort of individual capacities was I able to build? All those pieces that also are important factors. And that being said, when you think about our Indigenous communities, when it's not just an individual that's experiencing this high trauma, and it's not just the family, but it's the whole community, it means there are fewer places that the individual and the family can go to in the community to get the supports that they need. So this is just a snippet, a really small snapshot of what they call ACE attributable problems. So problems that can be attributed to unresolved ACEs. So in behavior, you have things like lack of physical activity, smoking, alcohol, drug use, missed work, physical and mental health issues, everything from severe obesity and diabetes to depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, broken bones. And there's a lot of others, but these are some of them. And in Minnesota, there have been other states as well, other communities that, you know, after the ACE study came out, they were like, well, how does this apply to us? Is there similar findings here? So in 2011, Minnesota added ACE questions to the BRFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And this is an interesting finding that they had, not surprising, but I think important to recognize that in Minnesota, ACEs, although common across all groups, it happens in every group, every socioeconomic group, every group you can think of. There are some groups that are affected more by ACEs than others. And so here in Minnesota, the African American and Black communities, 19% had 5 or more ACEs. And for our Indigenous American Indian communities, 23% of the individuals had 5 or more ACEs. So those are significantly higher levels than white or even like the Asian population. So one of the things that when this finding came out, there was sort of this fear of this blowback of like, see, they're just going to say, see, our communities are just messed up. But when you understand historical trauma, which is why it's so important to connect these dots, you understand why our communities have significantly higher rates of ACEs. And so I'm going to go through these next couple of slides super quickly, but unresolved trauma and social outcomes. So there's like an 80% correlation between trauma and addiction. 2/3 of those in recovery for addiction have experienced at least one ACE. And there's a lot of research that suggests that there are very elevated rates of trauma for incarcerated populations. Health disparities for our Indigenous communities. A lot of us know this, diabetes at a 3.2 times greater rate than other groups, than white, non-Hispanic groups. This is from IHS. Suicide rate, 72% greater than the general population. Life expectancy, 5.5 years shorter than any other race or population. And then social disparities, incarceration rates, 38% above national average. And again, recognizing that as Indigenous people in the United States today, we're between like 1.5%, I think, and 3% of the population. So those are disproportionate rates of incarceration. Out-of-home placement for our Native children, 2.7 times greater. Substance use issues, 7 times greater for alcohol, 1.5 times for drugs. And then the national graduation rate for Native students is 49.3% compared to 76.2% for white students. So lots of disparities that we see. And yet, despite all of these statistics, Indigenous people really remain invisible and marginalized and virtually erased from the collective consciousness of our community. We don't recognize these disproportionate rates, and we're not recognizing the things that happened in our communities. And there's not a lot of support yet for providing the resources that are needed in our communities to be able to heal from the historical trauma pieces, and then now the ongoing ACEs and intergenerational trauma. So one of the pieces that really helped me connect the dots. So when I was trained in the ACE interface, it was like, okay, so I understand historical trauma, that was separate. ACEs, neurodevelopment, how that impacts, and then people, these are the impacts of ACEs, all of these physical, social, behavioral, et cetera. But I couldn't understand why. Like, why were people experiencing all of these physical and mental challenges when they had high unresolved ACEs? And so as I got trained in the Center for Mind Body Medicine's curriculum and really started digging into the nervous system and understanding the autonomic nervous system, which there are two parts, the sympathetic nervous system, which controls our fight or flight response. It's essential for short-term survival. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And the parasympathetic nervous system, which controls our rest and digest state. This is essential for long-term survival. So when I understood what happens in our nervous system when we have a stress response and we're overwhelmed, that really helped me to understand why ACEs lead to the things that they lead to. And so there are different types of stress. So I want to be really specific. We're not talking about positive stress, which is a brief, it's brief. You might experience an increase in heart rate, mild elevation in stress hormones. I experience that every time before I present. Samantha and I were talking about that as well. That's a positive stressor. It's not constant. It doesn't stay with me. I'm not still feeling super nervous or whatever. I'm not feeling that elevated heart rate. So that those positive stress helps to build our resilience. That's actually really essential for us. Tolerable stress is something that can be really serious, but it's temporary. And this is really important. It's buffered by supportive relationships. So that's really, really key. Toxic stress is what we're talking about. So the pieces that we're talking about when we talk about ACEs and when I'm going to talk about the nervous system, we're talking about toxic stress. So it's this prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of protective relationships. And so if you think again about that, the graph with the green on the bottom, the red in the middle, the blue on the top, this is looking at what happens in the body when we are in the red. So we had talked about some of the emotions that come up with that, anxiety, fear, or maybe rage and anger and things like that. But these are some of the things that happen in the body. So one of the things that happens is our body gets a rush of adrenaline, and that adrenaline increases our heart rate and our respirations to get more oxygenated blood to our body so we can run faster or fight harder. Another thing that happens is some of the blood vessels in the large muscle groups open up to allow more blood into those areas, again, so we can run faster, fight harder. But blood gets diverted from places that are considered non-essential. So you might notice when you're feeling stressed out, cold, clammy hands, cold feet. That's because that blood is being diverted from your hands and feet to the large muscle groups to be able to survive the threat. Another thing that happens is our body gets a dump of cortisol. So cortisol basically shuts down our digestion. Digestion takes a ton of energy. And so if you are running for your life or fighting for your life, digesting breakfast, lunch, or supper, not important, right? So the energy that was going to be used for digestion, your digestion shuts down and that energy gets diverted to be able to try to survive the threat. Another thing that happens is our body releases glucose, and glucose, of course, is sugars, it's energy. It's a way that our body then can run faster, fight harder, because there's more energy that's released into our body. And initially, our immune system gets a bump, anticipating that in this fight or flight, we might be injured. So there might be bacteria or something that enters our body. So our immune system initially gets a bump. But if we stay in that fight or flight response, our immune system starts to tank. Another important thing, and you'll notice, like, even if you think about, like, at the end of a really stressful day or week, you might notice really tight muscles in the neck and the shoulders or the legs. That's because when we go into this fight or flight response, all of our muscles start to tighten to get ready to run or to fight. And then our senses get really sharp. So our pupils dilate to let more light in to be able to see better. Our hearing gets more acute. All of these things help us be able to recognize what's happening in our environment to try to survive the threat. So these things are super essential if we literally are in a physical threat. If we are, there's some sort of, somebody's chasing us or an animal. I saw a video not that long ago of this cougar that was, like chasing this guy down the mountain. Like, his stress response was on full bore, right? And he needed that in that moment to be able to survive. So really critical for short-term survival. but really detrimental when it stays on, or if it's very quickly activated. So when your heart is having to work really hard all the time, that can lead to heart attack. The large muscle or the blood vessels opening in the large muscle groups, high blood pressure, stroke, constant glucose dump can lead to diabetes. My dad, when he was alive, he got diabetes when he was, I think in like his mid 40s. He was a Vietnam vet, Native American. So yeah, he ended up with diabetes. And when he was really stressed out, it was so hard for him to manage his blood sugar numbers. And this is why, because his body was getting that constant dump of glucose. Inflammation happens in the body. Digestive issues, again, if your digestion is constantly shutting down because you're in the stress response, that's going to lead to all sorts of digestive issues. And then eventually some autoimmune disorders can show up. So this one is interesting. This is, again, is that, that blue, if you think about that graph. So this is both a combination, and I learned this from Dr. Bruce Perry, it's a combination of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So what happens during this is, again, if we can't run or fight from whatever the threat is, the next best option is to sort of check out and not be present with what's happening, to not have that acuity of what's happening to us because it's too overwhelming. So one of the things that happens is our brain actually releases these endogenous opioids. Our brain is able to produce its own opioids, and it's anticipating that we're going to get injured because we can't run or fight. So we're probably going to get injured. So it starts to release these endogenous opioids and other anesthetic neurochemicals that numb the body, that numb the mind, that numb our senses. So with these opioids, these natural opioids and anesthetic neurochemicals, our breathing slows. It might even get restricted. Our heart rate decreases. This also can be helpful in the short term. If you literally are in a fight and you get cut, a slower heart rate decreases the chance that you're going to bleed out really fast, right? So again, all of these things are about survival. Your blood pressure drops, your body might go rigid or limp. Your memory is impacted because your memory isn't taking in all the sensory input the way it normally would. It's not processing it in the same way because of these anesthetic neurochemicals that are numbing your senses and making it hard for your brain to process the information. And again, just that your senses get dulled as your emotional and physical numbing. But when this remains a chronic state, it can lead to things like dissociative disorders. It can lead to disconnection from the body. So a lot of times people, if they're in this sort of constant dissociative state, they're really prone to accidents. Because if you're not paying attention to your body and what your body's doing, you're much more likely to accidentally injure yourself. And also this disconnection from our emotions, not recognizing the emotions that are coming up. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but our emotions are very much connected to sensations in the body. So if we're disconnected from our body, we're probably also going to be disconnected from emotions. And one of the things, so this dissociative state was a state that I tended to be in for most of my childhood and even up into my adulthood. I would say it was probably 6 years ago that I learned about this stuff and started practicing mindfulness mindfulness practices that helped me to get back in my body, be more present. I was terrible at it at first, but I used to think I just have a bad memory. I just don't remember stuff. I don't remember my childhood. I don't remember things. But it really was about being in this constant state where my memory was impacted because of all the things I just talked about in the previous slide. So when we are in these dissociative states, it's really hard for us to connect to ourselves, much less to other people, much less to our children. So it's really important to start to recognize, where are we at in our nervous system? Are we in the green? Are we feeling open, curious, grounded, connected? Are we interventral vagal? Are we feeling anxious? Are we feeling angry? Are we feeling frustrated? We're probably in that fight or flight response. Or are we feeling checked out, numbed out, disconnected? We're probably in that blue. And so when we're in the red or the blue state, it's hard to connect to people in ways that don't cause harm to them. So I just sort of want to mention that that's been a really important sort of learning and insight for me as a mother, is that if I don't want to pass on these patterns, I have to start to recognize, where am I in my nervous system and how do I regulate to get back in my ventral vagal so that I can connect to my children, so I can be responsive to them emotionally. Some of you probably have heard of Dr. Dan Siegel. I love his work. And this is just a really quick, he calls it the handy model of the brain. I find it really helpful because it helps us understand what happens when we have a stress response and there's an amygdala hijack that happens. So if you would just do it with me, and this is great to teach to kids as well. But so this part here would be like your spinal cord. This part here would be the base of your brain stem. If you fold your thumb in, this would be your limbic region, your hippocampus and amygdala. And if you fold your fingers over, it's your cortex. And this part right here is your prefrontal cortex, the logical, rational thinking part of your brain. So when we have a stress response, let me back up for a second. When information is coming in, it comes in through the spinal cord, in through the brain stem, through the amygdala. If at some point in this lower part of the brain, it identifies it as a threat, it kicks off the prefrontal cortex. So we call this, you flip your lid. So when you flip your lid, the thinking part of your brain is no longer online. And this again is for survival. If I have a cougar that's chasing me, it's probably not good to be like, should I climb a tree? Should I run? Shoot, what was it that I'm supposed to do? No, I need to just react, right? So I can't have the thinking brain online. So this is good in those genuinely life or death situations. But if we constantly are getting our prefrontal cortex kicked off because so many things come in and our nervous systems have been trained to see it as a threat, then our thinking brain is not where we're responding from, but we are reacting out of our survival response, out of our amygdala, out of our limbic region and our brainstem. And so thinking about the human nervous system and understanding it and its role is really important. So what do you think the purpose of the nervous system is? Survival. So our brain and the spinal cord and all the nerve and nerve endings that go throughout our whole body are constantly taking in sensory information from outside our world as well as from inside of our body. And our nervous system and our brain is designed to sort of keep track of all of that and recognize what's a threat. Our brain keeps track of something called a body budget, which we'll talk more about next time. And so the whole purpose is survival. And our brain is wired through experience. So there are the cells in our brains are called neurons. And it's a little bit hard to see on this slide, but at birth, you can see there aren't a whole lot of neural connections yet. And this is because there haven't been a lot of experiences that the baby has had. So there's not a lot of neural connections, but between birth and age 7, you can see this explosion of neural connections that happen. It's really fascinating if you sort of step back and think about it for a second. Just take about 20 seconds and look around your space, look around your room and identify colors, shapes, how lighting hits things, shadows, name things, right? As you look around, we can do all of that. Our brain had to learn these things. These are not things that our brains knew when we came in. And so that's one of the reasons why babies sleep so much, is because their brains are learning all this new stuff. It's sort of sensory overload, all this new stuff. And they have to sleep to let their brains wire and connect, making sense of their world. And then they wake up again and they take in a bunch of sensory stuff, and then they sleep and let it wire and connect. So all of these things that we sort of take for granted are things that our brains had to learn. It is hard to see in this slide, and I apologize, but in the middle, there are some neural connections that are really robust. They're really dark. And those are the experiences that happen over and over and over again. So we're going to do just a quick example of what this is. So if you have your arms crossed, just go ahead and uncross your arms for a minute. And then go ahead and cross your arms. And as you cross your arms, notice what arm is on top. Is your left arm or your right arm on top as you cross your arms? So notice that, and then shake them out. And then cross your arms so the other arm is on top. What do you notice? What do you notice the second time I asked you to cross your arms with the other arm on top? What are you noticing? It's very uncomfortable, feels different, takes more thought. Yep. You had to be conscious of what you were doing. Yeah. So the first time I said cross your arms, none of us had to think about it because we've done it like, probably a billion times, right? Feels natural, feels normal. When I ask you to do it the other way, is there anything wrong with crossing your arms the other way? Like, is there anything bad about it or wrong? No, it's just that you haven't done it that much. So it feels uncomfortable. You really have to think about it. It is not an automatic response for you. Sight words would be another example of an automatic response that initially are not automatic. Anybody who's ever tried to teach a child how to read can be really difficult, right? Because they're trying to sound out these sight words. But after a period of time, it becomes automatic. At, but, the, he, she. You don't even have to think about it when you see it. So that's just an example of those experiences that get wired in, become automatic because we do it so often. Now, on the other part where it says at 15 years of age, so remember how I had mentioned that around pre-puberty, that's a time when the brain is starting to prune away synapses that are not used very often. So in the middle, where there's a lot of neural connections, the brain isn't very efficient. It takes a little while to get to where it wants to go because there's not a whole lot of those automatic responses yet. But by puberty, the brain has pruned away those things. The saying is use it or lose it. And any of us who have tried to learn a second language or learn a new, learn to play a musical instrument or something, if you don't practice it regularly, your brain is going to prune it away because the brain is sort of prime real estate. It wants the connections that are there to be robust and to be automatic. And so that's another really important time of brain development. And I had sort of alluded to this in that what I had learned from the International Trauma Conference is that stress hormones impact the architecture of the brain. And so there was a neuroscientist, his name is Dr. Marty Teicher, and he was also at the conference, and he studies the impacts of trauma on the brain. And one of the things he said is in their lab, they would study the brains of individuals who had not experienced a lot of trauma and those who had. And the structure of the brain physically looked different for the individuals who had experienced a lot of trauma, even if they didn't currently have a lot of stress or trauma, or they didn't have residuals, like they didn't have depression or anxiety or those types of, mental health issues or anything like that. The structure of their brain still looked different. They could tell which individuals had been traumatized as children and which ones had not. And I think I had mentioned this as well, but I think it's really important to note that our brain doesn't know the difference between physical pain and emotional pain. It processes pain the same way. I heard a researcher talk about, so she studied pain in her lab, and she said they would bring people in who were experiencing a lot of emotional pain, and they would give them ibuprofen or Tylenol, and they felt better. So when we think about this, I think it's important. So if you have a child that's on the playground at school and they fall off the monkey bars and they break their arm, would we ever say to them, you're okay, just go sit inside, pay attention. It's really important that you learn. You'll be okay. We would never do that, right? But if a child experiences bullying on the playground or on the bus or on social media on their phone, their brain is firing as if they are in physical pain because the brain doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional pain. So I think that's really important too, again, and I had mentioned, I think, when we think about things like the opioid epidemic and how opioids are really good for addressing pain, it helps us to understand why maybe some communities are especially susceptible to high use of opioids. I really love this quote from Dr. Julie Brown. It's been important for me on my own healing journey. She says, the process of healing doesn't always initially lead us to feeling better, because in order to heal, we must allow ourselves to feel again all that we've repressed. Feeling this can be hard, but by doing it, we actually get better, not just feel better. And so we're definitely going to talk more about emotions at the next session. But I had alluded to or mentioned that emotions often show up as sensations in the body. And so we're going to do a practice with something called a body scan. There's lots of different types of body scans, but let's go ahead and do a quick body scan. just sort of noting, starting at the top of the head. And as we scan down, we're noticing, what sensations are in the body. It might be tingling, tension, tightness, vibration, movement, flowing. So just scanning down through the head and face, noticing any sensations that might be present. Moving your awareness down to the neck and throat. And then out to the shoulders, and then streaming your attention down through the arms, becoming aware of what's present in the arms. What sensations are there? We'll come back up to the shoulders and scan down through the torso, noticing sensations in the chest, stomach, and lower abdomen, as well as the upper back, middle back, and lower back. What sensations are present in these areas of the body right now? We'll move our awareness down into the legs, noticing sensations in the upper legs, lower legs, and all the way out through the feet and toes. So again, maybe noticing sensations of tingling, vibration, flowing, movement, tension, tightness, constriction, pain. What's present in the legs and in the feet right now? All right, and then just coming back. So we just did a check-in with the body, maybe checking in for a moment with thoughts and emotions. And then just quick question, you can plug this into the chat or you can unmute yourself, but why is understanding ACEs and the stress response in the body and mind important for your work or for your personal life? Why does it, like, how can this help us understand what next steps might be? Yeah, to be able to heal, to move forward. I find that if I don't know what part of the nervous system I'm in, I tend to just be in those reactionary states. It's really easy to get into fight or flight or dissociation because of the experiences that I've had, because of the experiences my parents had, my grandparents had, my great-grandparents had. And so bringing more awareness to what part of the nervous system am I in can help me to know some tools and strategies that might be helpful for that. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Yeah, for healing, self-regulation, conscious awareness. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. And I say, we can't, as long as we remain unaware of something, we can't change it. We have to see it. We have to understand it in order to make meaningful change. And so thinking about the 4 parts of who we are, this is the Ojibwe medicine wheel. And so, that we believe that we are spiritual beings in physical bodies, having thoughts and having emotions. And so recognizing these 4 parts of who we are and tending to and balancing these 4 parts is really critical. And in the ACE interface, we talk about core protective systems, these individual capabilities that we have, the sort of innermost rung, then attachment and belonging, then community, culture, and spirituality, and how healthy and well each of these areas impacts all the other areas. So under individual capabilities, we have things like positive view. Positive view is really closely tied to hope. Positive view is the glass is half full, right? Good things can happen to me. Good things can happen in the world. It's not a Pollyanna view, though. It's not everything is great, because we recognize difficult things happen in life, but we also see and recognize the positive that happens. So a great way to build positive view is gratitude practices. gratitude journals. In the morning, as Anishinaabe people, we put our asema out, we say a prayer, we can put our gratitude in that as we put our asema down. So there's lots of different ways to build gratitude. Self-efficacy is the belief that what I do matters, the decisions that I make impact my life. And self-efficacy really requires that conscious awareness. That again, as long as we're not aware of what we're doing or how we're responding, we don't have the ability to choose in those moments. We have to have awareness to see where the choice is. And then self-regulation, and we're going to talk a lot more about self-regulation. So as we think about resetting and regulating the autonomic nervous system, there are practices that we can do to presence ourselves, to bring ourselves into the present moment and build this awareness of what's happening in our body, what thoughts are coming up for us, what emotions are coming up, how are our thoughts and emotions and body sensations connected, sort of reconnecting those parts of ourselves. And once we know where we're at in our nervous system, then we can choose how we want to respond. And the thing that's so great about this is our brain has what's called neuroplasticity, the ability to constantly change and rewire based on the experiences that we're having. So we have the ability to wire in new patterns and pathways for thriving. And so I just sort of call this regaining consciousness or awareness. And it really comes down to practicing being present. There's some pretty simple strategies, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's 5 things that you see, 4 things that you can touch or feel, 3 things that you can smell, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. So using your senses, 5 of your senses, to get back into your body scans, which we did, mindfulness meditations, and just mindfulness practices. Again, doing the dishes mindfully, reading to your children mindfully. Back in the day before I knew all this stuff, literally when I would read to my kids, I was ticking off in my brain my list of things to do after I got them to bed, was not present at all.